Hello everyone, very good afternoon and welcome back to Byju's Exam Prep. Welcome back to our discussion on internal security. I hope everyone had your lunch, you're refreshed because we still have a long day to go, but we have some very interesting, exciting topics to discuss today. So in the morning, we have covered some basics related to terrorism. We understood some essential concepts. Now we are left with the last topic here. Let us talk about insurrection, which is also a type of extremism. This is the last concept I wanted to cover. After this, we'll discuss Khalistan movement and Jammu and Kashmir in complete detail. Insurrection is also a type of extremism, right? We've already understood there are different types of extremism. The level of extremism can vary. The worst form of extremism is terrorism. Insurgency is also a violent extremism. Insurrection is another type of extremism. So, what exactly is this? What is insurrection? Let's see the definition and let's understand with examples. Insurrection is the refusal to follow the authority, a deliberate refusal to obey the orders of an authority. That is an act of insurrection. Let's say the police have imposed prohibitory orders. They have imposed Section 144. Right? I hope you know what is Section 144. Once a prohibitory order is in place, you cannot have a crowd assembling in that area. Not more than 4 people can assemble. Right? If someone does that, they will be arrested. So that is the order issued. But still, let's say a group of protesters assemble, they break the prohibitory orders and they protest against the government. That is a violation of the order of the authority. So even that can be seen as an act of insurrection. Is that clear? So this could even turn violent. An act of protest against the government where prohibitory orders are being broken, violated, the orders of the authority has been defied, and it could try to become violent as well. So insurrection is of two types. It can be non-violent, where protesters are simply breaking the rules, refusing to obey the orders and the authority. Or it could turn violent, resulting in a law and order situation. Now, please don't confuse this with insurgency or terrorism. They are national security threats. Insurrection is more of a law and order problem. It's more of a law and order situation because a group of protesters, a mob, is refusing to obey the orders, and either they are peacefully protesting in a non-violent way, trying to exert pressure on the government, challenging the authority of the government, or in some cases it can turn violent, resulting in riots, mob violence, which disturbs the law and order situation. This is an act of insurrection. This could further escalate, leading to a direct challenge to the government's authority itself. A violent mob which is protesting, engaging in riots and violence, could turn this into a rebellion as well, in order to challenge the authority of the state, trying to push the government out through protests. Is that clear? This is very different from insurgency, different from terrorism. In case of insurgency terrorism, there is an organized attempt to target the state. Weapons are used, bombs are used, explosives are used to wage insurgent wars and terrorist wars. In insurrection, this is more of street violence. If it turns violent, right, where orders have been defied, they are not following the orders of the authority, they're refusing to obey, and they might make an attempt to wrest control from the existing authority, meaning they might try to push the government out by engaging in street violence. Such mob unrest is an example of insurrection. Is that clear? So this can be of different types. It can be non-violent, it can be violent, and it can escalate to a level where the mob is challenging the government, trying to push the government out. This is what we call as insurrection. Now, let us see some examples. One best example for a non-violent insurrection can be found in India's own freedom struggle. In our freedom struggle, there were many instances where our freedom fighters refused to follow the orders. They disobeyed the authority deliberately to put pressure on the British to fight for India's independence. For example, the civil disobedience movement, the non-cooperation movement, Quit India movement, all these can be labeled as examples of non-violent insurrection. Our freedom fighters were challenging the British authority, refusing to follow the orders of the British police, right? They called for boycotting government offices, courts. They took to the streets to protest. That is an example of non-violent insurrection. The Anna Hazare movement against corruption, pushing for a Lokpal bill, is another example of non-violent insurrection. The protests were prohibited, prohibitory orders were in place, but still the anti-corruption movement went on, led by Anna Hazare and others. Even that is an example of non-violent insurrection. The recent farmers' protests against the controversial farm laws brought out by the Modi government. Even here, farmers from Punjab and Haryana, they broke the prohibitory orders, violated the orders of the police, sat in protest. Initially, it was non-violent. But later, few miscreants engaged in violence as well. So that's another example of insurrection. All right? So there are many such examples for non-violent insurrection. Other examples of violent insurrection and attempt to challenge the government can be found in other countries. For example, the 2010-2011 Arab Spring movement. Arab Spring was a pro-democracy revolutionary movement seen across African countries and West Asian countries. Across the MENA region, a number of pro-democracy protests took place against authoritarian governments. MENA is a geographical region, Middle East, North Africa. Is that clear? MENA stands for Middle East, North Africa. That is West Asia, North Africa. So this movement began in a small African country called Tunisia, which is located in North Africa. It was a genuine pro-democracy movement where people came out on the streets, protested against authoritarian dictatorship, and fought for democracy. The movement was non-violent but later turned violent, and they challenged the authority, pushed the leader out. Finally, the dictator resigned and stepped down. And this movement spread to other countries as well. The idea that people could protest, organize on social media. They used Facebook, WhatsApp, and the new platforms to organize, to plan. And they came together on the streets to protest against the government, against the dictatorship, and they tried to wrest control from the authority. From Tunisia, the movement spread to Egypt. In Egypt, the movement turned violent because the Egyptian dictator used force against the protesters. Many civilians were killed. Large-scale violence took place in Egypt. Finally, even the Egyptian dictator had to step down. So as two countries saw the transition happening and pro-democracy movement winning, the idea spread to other countries. Other powers, external foreign powers and regional powers, they took over. They sponsored the movement as well in their target countries. Iran sponsored the movement in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. US, European countries with Israel, Saudi Arabia and others, they sponsored the movement as well in their rival countries, in Syria, in Libya. Right? Their idea was to use this movement, exploit this to trigger an insurrection, to trigger a rebellion against the government, to throw the leaders out and cause a regime change. That is how Syria descended into a civil war. That is how Gaddafi was removed in Libya. And Western countries carried out a military intervention as well later in the name of supporting the rebels. So these are examples of violent insurrection where an attempt was made to wrest control from the authority, to throw the government and replace it with a new regime. So Arab Spring, that is the name given to this pro-democracy revolutionary movement seen across the MENA region. This is an example of violent insurrection. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 is another example. In 1979, there was a lot of resentment against the then Iranian ruler, the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran was seen as a US puppet. Can you believe it? At one point, Iran was an ally, a friend of US. It was not conservative and radical as it is now. Before 1979, there was a pro-US government, a monarchy ruled by the Shah of Iran. He had become very unpopular, so Iranian people started protesting against him. A revolution broke out. And this revolution was hijacked by Shia radical clerics. The Shia radical clerics, they took over the movement and made it a radical movement. So this became a violent insurrection. Eventually, the Shah of Iran ran away and the country was taken over by Shia radical clerics. Iran became a theocratic state, a radical state. And the supreme cleric, the Ayatollah al-Khamenei, became the supreme leader of Iran. Is that clear? So this is another example of violent insurrection where a direct challenge was posed to the government through mob unrest, street violence, and governments were thrown out to replace it with a new regime. So this is insurrection. It's a type of extremism. Now, why did I bring up this topic? The reason why I'm discussing insurrection is because recently there were incidents in USA and Brazil, which are stable democracies. In US and Brazil, an attempt was made to wrest control from the authority and to challenge democracy in US and Brazil. This was very disturbing. So that is when the term insurrection was in news. In the last elections, where Trump and Biden were contesting, that took place 4 years ago, right? Trump was the then incumbent president. Biden was contesting against him. In these elections, it was clear that Biden was winning. The results were coming out. Biden had the lead. It was very evident that Biden will become the next president. But what did Donald Trump do? As you know, Donald Trump is known for his eccentric behavior. He is known for his far right-wing ideology. He draws support from far right-wing extremists in the US. There are many extremist outfits in US as well, which are aligned with white supremacy, with radical Christianity as well, very conservative, radical religious views. They target the blacks, the minorities, immigrants, right? So Trump has a big support base amongst these far right-wing radicals. So Donald Trump, instead of being a responsible leader of the world's largest, most powerful democracy, he refused to accept the defeat. See, in a democracy, the hallmark of a democracy is peaceful transition of power. That is a feature of a functional democracy. Now, you take India, for example. Vajpayee lost the election. He conceded defeat. He publicly accepted we lost and transferred power to Manmohan Singh government. Next, Manmohan Singh government lost elections. They accepted we lost it. We were defeated. And peacefully power was transferred to Modi government. That is how democracy should work. During transition of power, if an attempt is made to question the legitimacy of the election, that is a grave challenge to democracy itself. That is what happened in the US. Donald Trump started tweeting that elections were manipulated. Without evidence, without any proof, he made unsubstantiated claims that elections were rigged. It was manipulated to favor Biden. So Trump, who was the president at that point, he was still the president. He himself was posing a threat to American democracy and to peaceful transition of power. He did not accept defeat. He did not concede that he had lost. So he spread fake news. He started engaging in propaganda on social media that elections were manipulated. What happened because of this? His right-wing followers were instigated. Usually, such followers are blind followers, be it on the left wing or right wing. Extremist elements who look up to a hero figure, who look up to a supreme leader, they blindly follow what the leader says. So once Trump started spreading the fake news that elections were manipulated, his right-wing extremist supporters they got triggered, and they attacked the US Capitol, which is like our parliament. The US Congress, the Senate, sits in the US Capitol. This is where the final election process was going on. The formal counting was taking place. The final rounds of the election process was taking place here. And the right-wing extremist supporters of Trump, they attacked the US Capitol by defying the government orders. They threatened to hijack the election. They threatened to disrupt the electoral process. They were trying to wrest control from the authority. Violence took place. Few people were killed as well. So this was a very serious incident. It was unimaginable in a country like US. This is what happens when politicians promote extremism. When politics leads to polarization on any line, religious lines, ethnic lines, they try to win votes based on these divisions. This is exactly what happens. Democracies can collapse. Right? There was a challenge to the American electoral process and to American institutions, which have stood for centuries. So when this incident took place, there was a lot of criticism against Donald Trump. Media outlets in US and around the world, they criticized Donald Trump for what he had done, and they called this an act of insurrection. It was an illegal attempt to wrest control from the authority and to challenge the validity of the democratic elections. Is that clear? That is when the word insurrection was used again recently. And the same thing happened in Brazil few years later. Brazil also went for elections recently, just last year. And the then Brazilian leader, Jair Bolsonaro, he also comes from the same far right-wing extremist ideology. Is that clear? He was a very good friend of Donald Trump as well. Obviously, both came from same ideological background. So Trump and Jair Bolsonaro were very good friends. These are the guys who were dismissing climate change as a conspiracy theory. These were the guys who said COVID-19 is an imaginary disease. That is how irresponsible they were. So in Brazilian elections, Jair Bolsonaro refused to accept defeat. His opponent, the current president, Lula da Silva, he had won the election. The results were coming out. Instead of respectfully accepting defeat and conceding it and transitioning power in a peaceful way, Jair Bolsonaro followed what his supporter had done, what Donald Trump had done. He said elections had been manipulated publicly. He said, I'll not accept defeat. These elections are manipulated. What happens when this comes from a leader who has a lot of fan following? The extremist followers, who are blind followers, they took to the streets. They engaged in violence, protested, and carried out attacks across Brazilian cities, especially in Rio de Janeiro. This was again an attempt to disrupt elections and to wrest control from the authority. Of course, the incidents were handled. There were minor incidents with regard to violence. The authorities contained it very quickly. But the challenge they posed to elections and democracy was very serious. So this was another incident of insurrection. So this is an act of extremism. Non-violent insurrection is still fine. As we saw during India's freedom struggle, it was legitimate. Throwing out the colonial rulers was necessary. Defying British orders, British authority was necessary to throw out British colonial rule. But such acts of violence that threatens civilized liberal orders and democracies is unacceptable, that too when violence is involved. So these are the types of insurrections, which is one type of extremism. All right. So please be aware of this. You never know. Even here, there can be a question, maybe a 10-mark question. UPSC can ask you, what is insurrection? What do you understand by insurrection? Can you give any examples? Right? So these are the points you can add to that particular question. So now I have completed all the basic concepts for this chapter. Now we will look at the terrorist challenges faced by India. We'll specifically look at Khalistan movement first. It's a big topic. We'll need some time to cover this. And we'll also look at Jammu and Kashmir. Is that clear? So we will basically be talking about religious fundamentalism. We will talk about state-sponsored terrorism, cross-border terrorism. We'll also discuss covert proxy war. They're all connected here. So let's understand the background to Khalistan movement. The topic is very relevant, very important today, because in the last two years, and especially in the last 13 years, we are seeing a planned attempt to revive this dormant movement. The movement was almost dead in 1990s. But in last 13 years, deliberate attempts are being made in India and abroad to revive the Khalistan movement. It represents a growing threat for India. Because back in 1980s, this was the biggest security challenge of that time. When Khalistan movement was at its peak, there was a very real threat of Punjab breaking away from India. It took enormous effort from India to wipe out this movement and eliminate the Khalistan movement. After being dormant for 15-20 years, now attempts are again being made to try and revive it, to create a new challenge for India. So let's understand what is the ideology behind the movement, what is their objective, which are the groups involved, what is the kind of support they are getting. Let's talk about this. Let's understand the issues, whether they have a genuine grievance or not, how India tackled the threat before, and what are we doing now. This is what we will discuss under this important chapter. Let's start with the background. See, Khalistan movement is essentially a separatist movement. What do you mean by separatist movement? It means the goal of these extremists is to break Punjab away from India, to liberate Punjab from India and establish Punjab as a independent sovereign nation, which they call as Khalistan. It's a separatist movement to create Khalistan as a independent sovereign nation by breaking Punjab away from India. Where does the word Khalistan come from? Khalistan is referred to in Sikh literature. If you look at the sacred books, the Guru Granth Sahib and other sacred works of the Sikh faith, there is a reference to a Sikh land, a land of the Sikhs, where there is good governance, peace, stability, and there is prosperity. This land of the Sikhs is referred to as Khalistan in Sikh literature. In fact, you find this in every religion, right? In every religion, you look at any sacred book, it talks about a utopian land. Like Islam talks about a caliphate. That's where the concept of an Islamic caliphate comes from, which has been twisted by these extremists. Quran talks about a caliphate, yes, a land of Muslims, but not in a violent way, not in a radical way. A prosperous land of Muslims. You look at Christianity, the Bible, look at Torah, the sacred book of the Jews. All the texts talk about a sacred land, a prosperous, peaceful, stable land. Look at Hindu scriptures, Ramarajya. It is exactly the same concept. Every religion, every book talks about it, right? This is not an extremist concept, but extremist elements have twisted it. They have twisted their own faith, given it a wrong interpretation, and they pursue violent activities in that name just to achieve their political agenda. If you look at jihadist elements, they are twisting Quran, misinterpreting Islam, promoting radical strands which doesn't exist at the core of Islam. Through radical strands like Wahhabism, Salafism, these extremists have given caliphate a different interpretation. right? The same happens in almost every kind of extremist movement, religious fundamentalist movement. Sikhism is again one of the most beautiful religions. If you have ever met a member of the Sikh community, right, if you have interacted with them, if you see the kind of contribution they make to the society, to the country, to the world, it is fantastic. If there is a disaster, Sikh organizations at the forefront of providing aid, right? They don't look at faith, they don't look at any divisions, they'll help anyone. If you've ever been to a Gurudwara, if you've ever had a langar meal, you can see the diversity there. You can see the tolerance. People of every faith are welcome. Anybody can go and have a langar meal, right? That is the beauty of religion. Rather, every religion has that element of tolerance. So, as I told you yesterday, problem is not with religion. No religion preaches extremism. Please get this right. I know many of you would have other views, which is largely due to influence of politics and social media. Move away from that narrow interpretation. Don't fall prey to communal polarization, right? You may have narrow views because you're not exposed to maybe what the religious scriptures are teaching. Maybe invest some time, look at other faiths as well. Or let's say you are atheist, you're agnostic, you don't have a faith, it's fine. Look at other religions. What do they teach? What principles do they promote? At the core of every faith, there is peace, there is stability, there is tolerance, prosperity. But these elements, extremists who exist in every faith, they self-appoint themselves as the guardians of their religion. They become self-appointed guardians. Nobody asks them to do it. They themselves will do it. They say that our religion is under threat. Other religions are targeting us. No religion can be wiped out, my dear friends. Religion has survived for thousands and thousands of years. If your faith is not that weak, your faith, your God is personal to you. That should be at your homes, not outside of the streets. If someone tells you otherwise, please understand they're engaging in political extremism. They are fighting for their own political narrow interests. Is that clear? Be it any faith, it is exactly the same. In Khalistan movement, even though there is no direct religious connection, the Khalistani extremists have tried to give it a religious color. They've tried to project this as a communal issue between Sikhs and Hindus. Is that clear? The Sikh community has made immense contribution to India. Right from independence, look at the Indian armed forces. Sikhs are there in large numbers. Look at Indian bureaucracy, Indian politics. Sikhs have made a big contribution. Green Revolution was driven by the Sikh community in Punjab. They're very much part of our nation, very much part of our nation building. Majority of the Sikhs, even today, even back in 1980s, did not support the Khalistan movement. It is a fraction of these elements who are brainwashed, indoctrinated, radicalized in the name of religion, in the name of communal politics, who have taken up this ideology and engaged in extremist violence. Is that clear? Now, where did this movement begin? What is its origin? To understand this, we have to go back to colonial India. We have to go before 1947. By 1940s, what was the situation in India? You would have studied in modern history. Our freedom struggle had gained momentum. We were on the cusp of independence. Because the world wars had weakened Britain, our freedom struggle had gained so much momentum that it was putting tremendous pressure on the British. They had realized that they could no longer control the Indian colony. So independence was becoming an eventuality. It was only a matter of when. It's not whether it will happen or not. By 1940s, it was guaranteed that British will leave. They have to quit. They couldn't manage India anymore. They knew the freedom struggle had gained momentum. If they stayed, they'll be thrown out. It was evident that India is heading towards independence. So obviously, many communities had concerns because our freedom struggle had been divided. Our freedom struggle had been divided Our freedom struggle had been divided on communal lines. Is that clear? Starting from early 1900s till 1947, during these 4 to 5 decades, communal politics had been introduced into our freedom struggle. Our freedom struggle inherently was largely secular, largely united. Different communities, castes, regions had come together to fight for independence. To weaken this freedom struggle, communal element had been added to divide the two largest communities in India, that is, Hindus and Muslims. This was the policy of divide and rule of the British. Is that clear? This was a continuation of their policy of divide and rule, dividing the country on religious lines, caste lines, regional lines, by encouraging extremists on every side so that they could continue their control over India. They could continue exploiting India. After 1857, the first war of Indian independence, and as the freedom struggle further gained momentum, the British realized that they had to do something. As they saw Indians getting united behind a common nationalistic cause, they realized that they couldn't control India anymore. So, to weaken the freedom struggle, to target the moderate freedom struggle led by the Indian National Congress, the British encouraged communal tendencies in the country. They deliberately supported extremists on both the sides. You would have read about partition of Bengal in 1905. It was a communal partition. They gave an excuse, they gave a reason that Bengal was too large to administer. But the division of Bengal into East and West Bengal was basically a communal division to draw a line between Hindus and Muslims. They would go on to encourage radical extremists on both the sides. The British backed the Muslim League led by Jinnah and others. They supported the two-state theory, the creation of Pakistan on religious lines as an exclusive state for Muslims. They backed the theory that Hindus and Muslims can't live together when we had lived together for centuries. They also backed Hindutva extremists later. By 1920s, reactionary Hindu elements had started countering the Islamist elements. So on one hand, the British were encouraging Jinnah, Muslim League, and their theory of Pakistan. Parallelly, they would back radical Hindutva groups as well, like Hindu Mahasabha and the others. So by propping the extremists on both the sides, the British were trying to hit the freedom struggle of India, the moderate secular freedom struggle of India. So this communalization destroyed India at that point. Large-scale communal violence started breaking out from 1900s all the way till 1947. Throughout this period, there were communal incidents in the country and it kept on increasing, especially after 1940, right until partition of India. Large-scale communal riots were taking place between Hindus and Muslims, encouraged by radical groups on both the sides. Is that clear? Eventually, the Congress had to accept the partition, given the state of violence, the division between Hindus and Muslims. There was no other alternative. It had become impossible to keep the communities together. That was the extent of communalization. The very social fabric of India had been destroyed. The tolerant, secular nature of Indian civilization had been destroyed. Why? For the sake of politics, for the sake of colonial interests. Right? Now, why am I telling this story? How is it related to Khalistan movement? It is related. Because as the Hindus and Muslims, the extremists were fighting each other, engaging in violence, targeted violence, many smaller communities, like the Sikhs, they felt threatened. Right? Obviously, any community would feel threatened when such large-scale divisions have opened up and large-scale violence is happening between two large communities. Smaller groups like the Sikhs naturally had a concern. This was understandable. I'm talking about before independence, before 1947, before India, Pakistan were created. So before independence, the concerns of some of the Sikh leaders was understandable. It was genuine. Forget the Sikhs. Many others had same concerns. Later, you will study Northeast insurgency. I'll explain why certain ethnic groups and tribal groups never wanted to join India. Their concern was legitimate at one point before independence. Many princely states didn't want to join Indian Union. They had their own reasons. However selfish, the monarchs had their own reasons. Is that clear? So the Sikh community, at least some of the leaders of the Sikh community, they had a genuine concern. What will happen to us? We are sandwiched, caught between Hindus and Muslims. Punjab is their homeland. Don't forget, Punjab was a very large province. It's not just the current state of Punjab in India. When I say pre-independence Punjab, I'm referring to Pakistani side of Punjab, the Indian side of Punjab. The Indian side of Punjab, I don't know if you know this, was very large, much larger than the current state of Punjab. It included Haryana, parts of Himachal Pradesh as well. Himachal Pradesh and Haryana were carved out later when we reorganized the states. So Punjab was such a large region which was considered as the homeland of the Sikh community. Rather, it was the land of the Punjabis. The Punjabi language and culture was the common identity here. This is broader than the Sikh religious identity. Don't think that in Punjab only Sikhs were found. No, Sikhs were in majority. There were Punjabi Hindus, Punjabi Muslims. What kept them together was their linguistic cultural identity, like Bengali identity. Right? There are Bengali Hindus, Bengali Muslims. They are present in West Bengal, Assam, in Bangladesh. So Bengali identity, which is a linguistic cultural identity, a regional identity, is a larger identity than religion. Similarly, when you say Punjabis, it refers to not just Punjabi Sikhs, but Punjabi Hindus and Punjabi Muslims as well. Punjab was a larger region comprising of today's Pakistan, Punjab, India's Punjab, parts of Haryana, Himachal Pradesh as well. So naturally, the Sikhs were worried whether their homeland will be protected. As violence divisions broke out between Hindus and Muslims, as partition violence began, as a refugee crisis started in 1947, members of the Sikh community were concerned what will happen to them. They were caught in between. Is that clear? So some of the Sikh leaders before independence had expressed the idea of creating a Khalistan. Khalistan, a land for Sikh community where Punjab region will be kept united. They opposed the partition, obviously, because partition would have divided Punjab between India and Pakistan. Right? So this concern of Sikh leaders then, and they proposing the idea of Khalistan to the British as a separate land for the Sikh community, was not wrong before independence. It was an understandable concern till then. Got it? Now, let us understand what happened after independence. Post 1947, things changed very quickly. India, Pakistan were created. What did Pakistan become? It became a theocratic state under the Muslim League, under leaders like Jinnah. The whole identity of Pakistan as a nation state became its communal identity. It became a country created on religious lines. Pakistan went on to adopt an official state religion. Pakistan is not secular. It's a theocratic state, meaning Pakistani state has an official religion. And it's not just Islam. It is a certain strand of Sunni Islam, which is the official religion of Pakistan. So when a country adopts such conservative, radical ideologies, when the whole identity of a nation is built on these lines, it will always lead to a disaster. It could be any religion, any country. The fate is the same. As Pakistan became theocratic, minorities were targeted. Correct? The Sikh and Hindu minorities were driven out. They all came to India as refugees. It was during this transition, large-scale communal violence, they further increased. Even Muslims were targeted who wouldn't subscribe to the rigid version of religion that Pakistani state was promoting. In Pakistan, Shias, Hazaras, Ahmadiyas, and even Sunnis who don't subscribe to this rigid version, they are all targeted. This was state-led oppression of religious minorities. So as this crisis was going on, the Sikh community realized that Pakistan is never an option for them. Majority of the Sikhs moved out post-partition. Today, you find few Sikh families and Hindu families as well in Punjab, in Pakistan that is, but very limited, very few. Majority of them moved out. They came to India. Why? Thanks to our founding fathers, our freedom struggle, our leaders, India became a secular nation. Right? Even though the word secular was not explicitly mentioned, we inherently were a secular civilization, a tolerant civilization, and this would be the path of India. From Mahatma Gandhi to Nehru, Sardar Patel, Subhash Chandra Bose, Bhagat Singh, everybody believed in the secular, tolerant tradition of the Indian civilization. This is what sets India-Pakistan apart. Even though India was a Hindu majority nation, because majority population is Hindu, that's a fact. Almost 85% of India's population is Hindu. Rest, everyone is a minority. Correct? Despite being a Hindu majority nation, India chose the secular path. This is what kept India on a different path. This is what led India to become a stronger nation. It is the diversity which allows India to thrive. Because any country which takes up majoritarianism, which allows majority community to dominate over minorities, those countries have destroyed themselves. Look at Myanmar, look at Sri Lanka, look at Pakistan. They are basket cases. They call them banana republics or countries which are gone rogue. Right? Any country which is built on religious lines, ethnic, racial lines, this is right-wing extremism. Such countries will never be strong nations. India's trajectory has been completely different. Today, we are a formidable power, a global power, a rising economy because of the secular traditions of India, the tolerant nature, which was imbibed into our constitution as well. So the India which was born was different. It was stark. It was a stark contrast with Pakistan. It was like opposites. So Sikh community felt protected in India. At least majority of them, they felt that India is safer for them. Why? Because here minorities will be persecuted. Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Christians, Sikhs, everyone was being targeted in Pakistan. Only option was to come back to India, settle on the other side of Punjab, right? So majority of the Sikhs had this faith in India that their rights will be protected. That is exactly what we did. The Indian Constitution, adopted few years later, what did it promise? It promised equality to everyone. No discrimination on the grounds of religion, right? It promised no discrimination and equality. Your religion doesn't matter to the state. So there was no reason why Khalistan idea had to be pursued after independence. That is my argument. Before independence, Khalistan idea had some validity. It was genuine concern of some of the Sikh leaders because they were worried what will happen to a minority community when they are caught between two large communities which are fighting each other. But after independence, things changed. The Sikhs got a homeland. They were protected. They felt safer in India. The constitution was secular. Promises were made. Fundamental rights were delivered. and India never displayed any majoritarian tendencies. So there was no validity or no justification for again raising the idea of a Khalistan or a separate nation for the Sikhs. That is why I don't agree that Khalistan ideology has a genuine root cause. It doesn't have a genuine root cause. Before independence, yes. In Pakistan, yes, the concerns were real. But after settling in India, after the constitution being adopted and majority of the Sikhs accepting Indian nationality, there was no reason for Khalistan idea to come up again. Majority of the Sikhs were happy. They had no grievances. They never felt discriminated. So where did the problem start? Let me explain this. This has to do a lot with politics and some Sikh leaders. Just a few elements did this. As I told you, majority of the Sikhs are peaceful. Even today, they don't support this ideology. They reject extremism. It's a peaceful community. They have contributed to India's rise. They don't feel discriminated. But some elements, political elements, who had their own vested interests, they started adding this idea, adding fuel to this idea that Sikhs will be threatened in India, that Sikhs have no future in India. This was largely manufactured. That is why I'm very clear on this, I'm very strong on this, that Khalistani movement has no valid grounds. If they were discriminated genuinely in a Hindu India, if they had been oppressed, persecuted, then okay, maybe you can understand where the ideology comes from, right? But post-independence, that was not the case. The Indian government ensured that everyone is treated equally. The constitution guaranteed that there was never an attempt made to discriminate against anyone on the lines of religion, right? Majority of the Sikhs were happy, peaceful, no grievances, right? They contributed to India's rise, as I told you, from agriculture to defense to nation building to bureaucracy. So what happened? What went wrong? Who started this problem? It was few political leaders. It was few political elements and some religious elements who still held a radical idea that they should fight for a separate land. In 1950s, when India was busy reorganizing the country internally, some of the Sikh parties and leaders, they formed a movement, a cultural movement, a political cultural movement was launched called the Punjabi Suba movement. Is that clear? By 1955, when the reorganization process was going on, because now the big task was to reorganize India internally. You would have studied this in polity, in modern history as well. There were very large provinces the British had left. There were many small princely states. It didn't make any sense, any logical, rational sense to create states out of them. There was a need to reorganize internally so that practically we could administer, govern these areas. So the states reorganization had become the focus of the government. Committees were set up. You would have studied in polity and history. Different committees were set up. They were giving recommendations on how we can reorganize the states internally. When the reorganization was taking place, some of these Sikh leaders, a few Sikh leaders who had their own political, religious agenda, they raised an unnecessary movement called the Punjabi Suba movement, a political, cultural movement led by Akali Dal. Today, there is a major party in Punjab, the Shiromani Akali Dal, a right-wing party which often aligns with the ruling BJP. Its predecessor was the Akali Dal. Shiromani Akali Dal's predecessor was Akali Dal. This party, with few extremist, radical Sikh leaders, political religious leaders, they launched this movement and they raised a few demands. This is still fine. It is acceptable. In any democracy, everybody has a right to form an association to launch a movement and raise their issues. Nothing wrong with it. But the problem was with what they were demanding. Problem was not just with the movement. Movement is fine. Any community can express its political issues, its cultural issues. There's nothing wrong. That is why a democracy is for. Problem is with what they were asking. What they were asking was not rational. It's not something India could have addressed. It's not something India could have fulfilled. Let me tell you what the demands were. As the reorganization was going on, first we had a committee called JVP committee. Nehru was also part of it. The JVP committee, I hope you know, I hope you remember, had considered language as a basis to reorganize India. It evaluated whether can we create linguistic states, because there was no logical basis on which the states could be reorganized. It was very complex. The idea was whether can we use language, because different regions have different languages. Based on the major languages, can we create states for administrative reasons without affecting the unity of the nation, the integrity of the nation? This question was examined by JVP committee and few other committees, but they all rejected the basis because they all felt even language can become a strong identity and a strong divide. Then tomorrow, what if on linguistic lines the country breaks up? What if different demands come from Tamilians, Punjabis, Marathis, Kannadigas? The government will not be able to deal with it. Apart from communal caste divisions, regional divisions, linguistic divisions might increase and threaten the integrity of the union. So based on this concern, initially language was rejected as a basis for reorganization. There was a concern that if linguistic states are created, it will increase divisions and threaten the integrity of the nation. Got it? Then, under certain circumstances, the first linguistic state of India was created. Even after language being rejected as a basis for state creation, in 1950s, in early 1950s, due to certain conditions, Government of India was forced to create the first linguistic state of India. The first state was created on the basis of language. Can you tell me which state was this? Very good. Andhra Pradesh. It was carved out of Madras. Why? Because there was tremendous pressure on the central government. A Telugu leader, Potti Sriramulu, he led a Telugu movement demanding the creation of Andhra as a separate state for Telugu-speaking people by carving it out of Madras. Is that clear? Madras and of course the princely state of Hyderabad as well. Because Potti Sriramulu and his followers believed that Telugu identity will not get recognition if they don't have a separate state. So Potti Sriramulu went on a hunger strike. He said, I'll not have food until the demand is fulfilled. And because of the hunger strike, he lost his life. He passed away. And the moment his news spread, the news of his death spread, it triggered large-scale violence in the Telugu belt. Large-scale violence broke out, which brought a lot of pressure on the government of India. And finally, the government went ahead and created the first linguistic state of India, that is Andhra. Later, it became Andhra Pradesh. Now, India realized that, okay, we created a linguistic state, but it hasn't threatened the integrity of the nation. Country's integrity was still fine. Andhra became peaceful very quickly. It started functioning as a separate state. There were no similar demands coming up from other places. So government realized that, okay, on the basis of language, we can create states. We can still manage it. So the next committee, which was dealing with reorganization, that is the Fazal Ali Commission, the State Reorganization Commission, also called the Fazal Ali Commission, Fazal Ali Committee, finally accepted language as a basis. By looking at the model of Andhra, the example of Andhra, now there was some guarantee that, okay, language-based states can be created and it will not threaten the integrity of the nation. So with this confidence, Fazal Ali Committee recommended linguistic internal reorganization to create the states. Government of India accepted the recommendation, and accordingly, the linguistic states of India were born. Tamil Nadu, Mysore, which later became Karnataka, Kerala, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Punjab as well. Right? But however, when Fazal Ali Commission was yet to submit its recommendations, leaders of Punjabi Suba movement, they submitted a demand. What was their demand? They wanted Punjab to be carved out on linguistic lines, a land for Punjabi speakers. This is fine. That is how every other state was later created as well. But they said that Punjabi speaking, non-Punjabi speaking areas have to be separated. They also said that Punjabi speakers will enjoy exclusive privileges within Punjab. This was the demand of Punjabi Suba movement, one of the demands. Is that clear? When reorganization was still being considered, when Fazal Ali Commission was yet to recommend language as a basis, the Sikh leaders of Punjabi Suba movement, they expressed a demand to Government of India that create a state called Punjab on linguistic lines, but separate the Punjabi speaking areas. That should be exclusive to Punjabi speakers. Rest of it, which is part of Haryana, Himachal, that should be non-Punjabi speaking area. This was the demand they raised. And they said in Punjabi speaking area, the Punjabis will have exclusive rights. Meaning others who don't speak Punjabi, they might be discriminated. Now, this demand was very, very controversial. Why? I'll tell you why. Who are the Punjabi speakers? Who speak the Punjabi language? Punjabi Hindus, Punjabi Muslims. But the numbers are very small. Majority of Punjabi speakers would be Sikhs. So if we create a state on these lines and make it exclusive to Punjabi speakers and give them special privileges, what are you doing essentially? You are doing a communal division indirectly. In the name of linguistic division, they were asking for a communal division within India on religious lines. So there was no way India would have accepted this. We had already suffered the horrors of a communal partition with Pakistan. There was no way Indian government would agree to this. It was an unreasonable demand. Linguistic creation was anyways created, right? Punjab being created was a linguistic division, but doesn't mean anyone will have exclusive rights, separate Punjabi areas and non-Punjabi areas. That is unacceptable. Now a Marathi will have full rights in Tamil Nadu. A Tamilian has full rights in Karnataka. Kannadiga has full rights in Andhra Pradesh. There is no such discrimination. Linguistic division was only for administrative reasons, nothing else. You be a Gujarati, you be a Malayali guy or a Kannadiga, Tamilian or a Hindi speaker, your rights are exactly the same everywhere in the country, right? But what Punjabi Suba leaders were asking was unacceptable. It was controversial. Their idea was to push for a communal partition indirectly through linguistic division. So given this circumstance, India rejected the demand. The Nehru government said it's not acceptable. Even though linguistic division will be done, Punjab will be created separately, but there will be no exclusive areas and no separate Punjabi areas. Because that would be essentially benefiting only Sikh community that would be on communal lines. India didn't want any such internal communal tensions unnecessarily when majority of the Sikhs were peaceful and India was never discriminating against the Sikhs. So correctly, the government of India rejected the demand. Now what happened because of this? It instigated the Punjabi Suba leaders. See, what did Akali Dal want? It wanted votes. It wanted to create a vote bank, win elections. It's a political motive. And they were using this issue They said India is discriminating against Sikhs. It's a Hindu India. It's a Hindu government discriminating against minority Sikhs. See, they're not accepting our demand. They are discriminating against the Sikh community and they are violating our rights. They started spreading this propaganda. These false claims were spread to create a ideological support for a Khalistan movement. This is one of the initial triggers. Then, along with it, the Punjabi Suba leaders demanded that Punjab should not be trifurcated. They wanted Punjab to remain as it is, with separate Punjabi areas for Sikhs and non-Punjabi area for others. That was the demand which India had rejected. So what Fazal Ali Commission had recommended was, since Punjab is very large, it has to be broken into three. It was divided into today's Punjab, Haryana, and Himachal Pradesh. This trifurcation angered the Akali Dal. Why? Because they believed that their land was being broken. Their resource, their identity was being taken away, even though this was a practical decision. It was only on practical administrative grounds that the Fazal Ali Committee had recommended the trifurcation of Punjab. Now, can you imagine a large state like Punjab, Haryana, Himachal together? Based on certain factors, the Fazal Ali Commission had recommended the trifurcation, which was accepted by Government of India. Even if there were grievances against it, it could have been addressed. But what did Akali Dal leaders say? They said, Hindu India is again discriminating against the Sikh community. See, they are breaking our land. First of all, it's already broken. Half of it went to Pakistan. Now they are breaking it again into three parts. Unnecessary propaganda was carried out purely for electoral political reasons. Nothing else. It was only few elements who were doing it. Some of the radical Sikh leaders were doing it, not the whole community. Slowly, the idea was being sown that Sikhs will be discriminated. Then came the question of Chandigarh. Now, since Punjab, Haryana, Himachal Pradesh were created by trifurcation, the question of capital for Punjab and Haryana was coming up. The only major city present here was Chandigarh. So Fazal Ali Commission and Government of India suggested that let's make Chandigarh the joint capital. It was again a practical suggestion, a realistic suggestion, because there was no other major city which could have been the capital for Haryana. Clear? And also making joint capitals is not a new thing. We have done it recently. Hyderabad has been made a joint capital for Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. But Punjabi Suba leaders did not accept this. They wanted Chandigarh to be the sole capital for Punjab. They wanted something else to be found for Haryana. Now, this is the right of the Indian government. States don't have a say in this. What does the Constitution say about reorganization? There is an article. Can you tell me which article? Which article of the Constitution deals with reorganization? And who has the powers to reorganize? Very good. Himanshu has given the right answer. Article 3. Article 3 says the Parliament, essentially the center, has the full authority to reorganize the country internally. Center and Parliament will create how many states they want. They will assign the capitals. It is their task. Of course, they'll consult the people, consult the states. But the decision is not up to them. It's up to the Parliament. Right? So their demand was fine. But when India rejected it, it should have been accepted. Due to practical reasons, Chandigarh was made the joint capital for Punjab and Haryana. But Punjabi Suba leaders got instigated. The radical elements, Akali Dal leaders, they felt triggered that India had refused all their demands. So based on this, they started spreading a propaganda that this is a Hindu India. It's a Hindu government discriminating against the Sikh community, which was a false, it was a lie. Then came the sharing of Indus rivers, 1960. In 1960, we signed Indus Water Treaty with Pakistan to share the Indus waters. The Indus Basin was divided. Western rivers were given to Pakistan. Eastern rivers were largely given to India. So after that, we had to decide the sharing of waters between the northern, northwestern states of India. The three rivers, Ravi, Bias, Satluj, they are critical for Punjab, Haryana, Himachal, and the region around it. It's a lifeline for all the states, not just for Punjab. Yes, Punjab is the land of five rivers. Punjab's agriculture is heavily dependent on them, and so is Haryana, so is Himachal Pradesh, so is the region around it for irrigation, drinking, power generation. These waters are crucial for everyone. So Punjabi Suba leaders demanded exclusive rights and higher share for Punjab. Again, how is it acceptable? It's not. So center rejected it. Center said that's not possible. We will fairly divide the waters to ensure Haryana's needs are met, Himachal's needs are met. We'll also take care of your needs as well. It will be a fair division. But Punjabi leaders, the Suba leaders, rejected it, and Akali Dal leaders started carrying out a campaign on this. So by 1960s, they were raising the flag of Khalistan, saying every demand of ours is not being met. Our grievances are not being addressed. And they started a false campaign that this is deliberate discrimination by a Hindu India against the minority Sikhs, when that was not the case. Majority of the Sikhs didn't have this problem. It was few of these leaders who were twisting it, projecting this idea that India was discriminating against the Sikhs. Their only goal was electoral polarization. Polarize the Sikhs to capture votes, to win elections. Is that clear? It was a political agenda. They wouldn't realize the impact. They wouldn't realize what would happen later. This is how the idea of Khalistan was fueled in 1950s without a valid reason and without a valid grievance. Naxalism, I told you there are genuine root causes. The failure of development, the injustice done to the tribes, the farmers. Those are genuine reasons. Here, there was not a single genuine reason. Or else majority of the Sikhs would have rebelled. No one has rebelled. They still favor India. They don't support Khalistan movement. Why? Because the movement is never rooted in a genuine root cause. It's a false created idea that India discriminates against the Sikhs. And some of them have bought this idea and they are the ones leading this movement. So by 1960s, the idea was sown that Khalistan should be created. The sacred Sikh land mentioned in Sikh literature should be created, and now religious angle was added to it. So gradually, the movement was picking up. In 1960s, it was a very minor movement. It was not even a concern. No security threat existed as of then. But slowly, the momentum was building up. Some of the radical elements had given a call for separatism, saying India is not meeting any of our demands, so let's fight. Let's start a separatist war, break Punjab away from India. So political struggle had begun. Even though there was no violence, no terror groups had been created, at least the political struggle had begun for a separatist movement. Then something happened in Western countries. As you know, the Sikh community has a very strong diaspora. Since the British days, members of Sikh community have migrated from India, settled in different parts of the world, and wherever they went, they have integrated into Western societies and their countries, be it US, be it Canada, or West Europe, especially UK, Germany, even France, Belgium, Italy. In all these places, you find a very strong Sikh community. Since many decades, even in colonial era, Sikhs were migrating in large numbers to find better opportunities. So by 1960s, there was already a strong diaspora community in the Western countries. Is that clear? Now, some of the members of the diaspora, they started buying the ideology of Khalistan. In India, Punjabi Suba leaders under Akali Dal and few radical clerics, they had raised the idea of Khalistan, calling for a separatist political movement. They were campaigning that India, a Hindu India, is discriminating against Sikhs. This propaganda was bought by some of the elements in the Sikh diaspora without understanding the reality on the ground, without understanding what the Sikh community actually felt. These elements assumed that Sikhs are being targeted, that Sikhs have to be liberated from India. So, in Western countries, particularly in Canada and especially in Europe, in UK, Germany, some elements within the diaspora, they joined the Khalistan ideology. They started claiming that Punjab should be separated from India. And one individual, Dr. Jagjit Singh Chauhan, he declared that Khalistan had been created. He unilaterally declared that Khalistan is a new country now. He even introduced a flag, which you see even today. Right? They use the Khalsa symbol. Khalsa is a sacred symbol of Sikhism. These extremist guys are misusing it. Sikh faith has nothing to do with this extremist movement. Right? They've taken the Khalsa symbol, a sacred symbol, and misusing it for their extremist cause. He introduced a flag, the yellow colored flag with the Khalsa logo. He also introduced a so-called currency. He started petitioning Western governments to recognize Khalistan as a new country. I mean, it was very small initially. It's not that it was a threat, but he created the momentum in Europe. Dr. Jagjit Singh Chauhan declaring the creation of Khalistan as independent. He raised the flag as well with some Sikh members with him. Introduced the so-called currency, so-called passport, something like what Nityananda has done. It seems ridiculous, right? But this added momentum in Europe, amongst the diaspora, among some impressionable minds, that we can create a separate country. So the idea got a further momentum in Europe, and these elements tied up together. The Akali Dal Punjabi Suba leaders in India, in Punjab, who are leading a separatist political movement by now, and some radical elements in the diaspora. This was all their fantasy, that Sikhs were being oppressed, that they should have a separate country, and just because they declared Khalistan, they thought everyone will recognize Khalistan. Driven by this, they started working together and a conference was called. They started adding more religious color to it. They misused a sacred Gurudwara, Anandpur Sahib. It's a sacred shrine. Anandpur Sahib is a very sacred Gurudwara in Punjab, a beautiful shrine. They misused the sacred place to hold an assembly, a conference of all the radicals, extremists coming together. And what did they do? They brought out a resolution, Anandpur Sahib resolution. Basically, a document highlighting their demands and what they will do to create Khalistan if India does not meet the demands. Security experts, intelligence officers who have worked on the issue, they consider Anandpur Sahib resolution as a critical point. Until then, it was some silly sideline movement by some extremist elements on the sidelines. Now it was getting mainstreamed. Until then, it was just a sideline movement. Nobody cared about it. Someone was raising a flag. Someone was declaring a separatist movement. They had no support, no arms, no weapons, right? It wasn't a security threat at all until now. But here, when Anandpur Sahib resolution was brought out, several radical leaders in India and abroad had joined together to bring out this document stating their demands, their claims. It was like a manifesto that these are our demands. If you don't meet them, if you don't create Khalistan, we'll take up arms. We'll lead a separatist, violent, insurgent movement to separate Punjab from India. That is why security experts, intelligence officers who have worked on this, they consider this to be the starting point of the armed rebellion. After Anandpur Sahib resolution was adopted, we started seeing the emergence of armed groups. A call was given to take up weapons to fight an armed rebellion against India. Is that clear? But still, it was a low scale movement because they didn't have support. They didn't have access to funds. They didn't have access to weapons. Even though it was an armed struggle, right? It was still a low scale movement, something that India could have dealt with it on its own, something that India could have wiped out within years. So through mid 70s and late 70s, through mid 1970s to late 1970s, we started seeing the emergence of these radical armed organizations without much support. So it was just a low scale separatist insurgency. This was something India could have tackled, India could have crushed, and we could have wiped out the Khalistan movement. But the real threat began later. 1979 was a crucial turning point. Something happened in the region. Global geopolitics is connected to what happened here in Punjab. It was after these events that Khalistan movement received tremendous support from abroad. So let's take a short break now and we will discuss what happened later after the break. Right now, we have understood the background, the origin, the grievances that some of the leaders had, how the call was given for Khalistan movement, and how a low-scale armed insurgency had started. As I told you, it was just a minor threat, something we could have dealt with. But something happened in our neighborhood around the same time, a global geopolitical development, which would directly add fuel to this fire which was starting in India. So let's take a break. We'll come back and we will discuss this in detail. We'll study the rise of Khalistan movement, how India countered it, and why we are seeing a revival in the Khalistan movement. So take a 15 minutes break. It's almost 3:25. Let's come back at 3:40. All right. So come back at sharp 3:40 and we'll continue the discussion. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the session. So, before the break, we were talking about Khalistan movement, how the movement started, and how the developments took place through 1960s and 1970s. I told you that till late 1970s, it was a low-scale movement. A political separatist movement had started. A small-scale armed insurgency also had started, but it was not a major threat for India. But by late 1970s, there were few developments in our neighborhood, geopolitical developments, which directly influenced the Khalistan movement. So let's understand what happened. The year was 1979. In Afghanistan, there were few developments taking place during the Cold War. This is where the topic merges with international relations. Between the Afghan conflict and Khalistan movement, a direct connection would develop, which instigated the Khalistan movement further. How did this happen? It happened because of the Cold War rivalry between the Soviet Union and US. As they were targeting each other, as they were engaged in a geopolitical rivalry against each other, US and Soviet Union were striving for their influence in almost every country. Soviet Union was pushing communism. US was pushing democracy, capitalism everywhere. This geopolitical rivalry spilled over into Afghanistan. Because see, back then Afghanistan was a neighboring country of Soviet Union. Soviet Union was a very large country that included Central Asia as well. So today you have countries like Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. They were all part of Soviet Republic. So Soviet Union had direct borders with Afghanistan back then, before 91. So in Afghanistan, there was a pro-communist government. Until 1979, there was a pro-communist government which was fully in support of Soviet Union. But the Americans were meddling in Afghanistan, just like they meddled in Ukraine to undercut Russian influence. Similarly, the US was trying to undercut Soviet influence in Afghanistan. As the American influence increased, Soviet Union saw this as a threat. And because of their rivalry, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Very similar to what happened with Ukraine. As NATO countries were trying to pull Ukraine into their side to undermine Russian influence, that is what triggered Russia to invade Ukraine. Something similar had happened in 1979 in Afghanistan. Soviet Union was deeply concerned because obviously this was Soviet Union's neighborhood. Afghanistan was a direct neighbor sharing a land border with Soviet Union. So Soviet Union would not tolerate any rise of democratic or Western American influence in its neighboring country. So to prevent this, Soviet Union committed a blunder, a major blunder, by invading Afghanistan. It invaded the country, toppled the government itself, and Soviet forces occupied the country. Is that clear? Now, the Americans, they sensed an opportunity. Because see, in Afghanistan, the people here, they are battle hardened. They've been used to invasions, wars, battles from centuries, especially the Pashtuns. The Pashtuns are the majority ethnic group in Afghanistan. They are found in Pakistan as well. Pashtuns don't entertain any kind of outside interference or occupation of their land. The Pashtuns are battle hardened. They are used to wars since centuries. The terrain, geography of Afghanistan is also very complicated. It's not easy for an outside force to occupy Afghanistan. Many powers have tried, but they've all failed. The British tried to occupy Afghanistan. Later, they were thrown out by the same Pashtuns. Right? The British Empire, the mighty British Empire, could not survive in Afghanistan. It was thrown out. The Soviets, they also made a similar attempt, but they didn't realize how the Pashtuns would resist their invasion and occupation. The Americans, they sensed an opportunity here, and they tied up with Pakistan along with other allies to sponsor a resistance against the Soviet forces. So the US, through its intelligence agency, the CIA, along with other European allies like UK, other allies like Saudi Arabia, they all aligned with Pakistan. Why? Because Pakistan was already part of the American power bloc during the Cold War. So US, UK, Saudi Arabia, and few others, they provided funds and weapons into the hands of Pakistan's army and ISI. And they asked them to further radicalize the Pashtuns and raise the Afghan Mujahideen as a resistance against the Soviet occupation. The Pashtuns were already considering to launch a resistance movement against Soviet occupation. So Afghan Mujahideen was taking shape. Essentially, a religious war on religious lines was being fought. So Pakistan became the middleman for US and other countries, and they directly supported the creation and the rise of Afghan Mujahideen. Saudi Arabia, which was interested in promoting radical extremism for its own geopolitical interests, it was trying to emerge as a leader of the Muslim world. It funded the radical madrasas to induce radical Wahhabism and Salafism. Pakistan had already created a radical base along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. So here, with American money and weapons, Pakistan established a full-fledged terrorist infrastructure to aid and train and support the Afghan Mujahideen so that the Pashtuns could fight and resist against the Soviet occupation. This was the American covert war, covert proxy war against Soviet Union. And Pakistan was directly helping the US. So CIA and the ISI, along with other allies, they directly played a role in the creation and rise of Afghan Mujahideen. Is that clear? It was a radical insurgency built on religious lines to fight the Soviets, because Soviets were communists. Communists don't entertain religion, right? Communists are atheists, whereas Pashtuns were right-wing extremists focusing on extreme religion. For them, their religious principles were more important. So it became a religious war essentially to throw out the atheist communists. The Pashtuns were ready to resist Soviet occupation to protect their land, their religion, and their values. And they got support from Pakistan and US and others. So very quickly, the Af-Pak border became a terrorist hub. Pakistan turned it into a terror factory. I'm not even underselling it. Virtually, literally, quite literally, this border area became a terror factory. Multiple terror camps were created to further radicalize the Pashtuns, give them military level training, supply weapons to them, give funds to them so that they could resist the Soviet occupation. So as a result, Pakistan had become critical for US and Western countries. Pakistan was the one enabling this war, backing the Afghan Mujahideen, controlling it on behalf of the US. Now Pakistan was certain that Western countries will not question Pakistan even if it diverted part of the funds and weapons and the infrastructure to target India. Because remember, in mid-70s, I told you, Pakistan had sworn to take revenge against India for 1971. Pakistani leadership had given a call to bleed India through 1,000 cuts by launching covert proxy wars across India to weaken India and to destabilize India. Now, this came as a blessing for Pakistan. At the right time, when Pakistan was looking to avenge 1971 and wage a covert proxy war against India by sponsoring terror movements to destabilize the country, at the same time, these developments happened in Afghanistan. So Pakistan was critical for Western countries. US and European powers would never question Pakistan what it would do as long as they supported Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviets. Pakistan utilized this opportunity, this geopolitical opportunity, and diverted the same funds, weapons, and terrorist infrastructure against India. So even before Pakistan sponsored terrorism in Kashmir, it was the Khalistan movement which was first sponsored by Pakistan. Kashmir insurgency terrorism came later in 1987. Few years before that, by 1979, Pakistan was already exploiting the opportunity in Punjab. Punjab is a border state, don't forget that. Pakistan was closely watching the developments. It saw the rise of the separatist movement. It saw what was happening in the diaspora community, how Khalistan movement had started. So all Pakistan had to do was add fuel to the fire. So it diverted the money supply. It was freely flowing. Billions of dollars were being thrown here at the hands of Pakistan to raise the Afghan Mujahideen. Even if Pakistan diverted few $1 million, America and European countries wouldn't question Pakistan. Even if Pakistan diverted some weapons into the hands of anti-India groups, they would not question Pakistan. Why? Pakistan was critical for them. Pakistan was their ally, their best friend. More importantly, India had aligned with Soviet Union in 1971. US had become hostile to India in the 1971 war. US was targeting our nuclear and space program. So it was convenient for the US as well. They wouldn't care if Pakistan supported anti-India terror groups by diverting the same funds and weapons and the terrorist infrastructure to support Khalistan groups. Is that clear? Since US was waging this war against Soviet Union, US saw it was justified to target India as well. Though US didn't do it directly, it didn't put pressure on Pakistan to not divert the funds and weapons to target India. It gave Pakistan a free hand. As long as you're supporting Afghan Mujahideen, it's fine. We don't care what you do with the money, with the weapons. Even if you're supporting anti-India terrorists, we don't care. Do whatever you want. This was the free hand given to Pakistan, and ISI and the Pakistani army fully exploited this opportunity. So what they did was they pumped Afghan drugs produced by the Pashtun warlords into Punjab. Drugs played a critical role in this conflict. Afghan drugs, which was grown on a large scale, these opium fields were controlled by Pashtun warlords. It was their primary business, illegal business. So Pakistani intelligence had ties with these Pashtun warlords. Pakistan was already involved in smuggling and trafficking Afghan drugs. So Afghan drugs were conveniently brought across from Pakistan and pushed into Punjab. The Khalistani leaders who had taken shape, Khalistani groups had started forming. They were given full shelter and support along the Af-Pak border. Is that clear? So this was Pakistan's first major covert proxy war against India. Various Khalistani groups had taken shape by then. So these outfits and their leaders were sheltered by Pakistan along the Af-Pak border. The same funds, weapons, and terrorist infrastructure and also drugs, which was fueling Afghan Mujahideen in Afghanistan against Soviet Union, the same was diverted to support the Khalistani outfits. These terrorists who had declared a war against India, who were already engaging in insurgency, right? They were turned into full-scale terror groups by giving them a safe haven in Pakistan. Basically, they got a sanctuary, a terror sanctuary was created for them. They could easily cross the border and take shelter in Pakistan away from Indian forces. From here, they would pump drugs into Punjab. Why? Because this will raise even more funds for their operations. That became a illegal criminal business of these Khalistani extremists. And more importantly, it will indoctrinate the Punjabi youth. By 1980s, Punjab was dealing with a serious drug menace. Afghan drugs were freely flowing, and in every college, every school, every household, drug addicts came up. This was an illegal criminal business that was thriving with direct connection with Khalistani terrorism. So the drugs was bringing money as well, both to Pakistan and to the Khalistani terrorists. It was aiding their operations. They could easily brainwash the youth because drug addicts, as I told you, are easy to radicalize and indoctrinate. The drug menace became a serious problem, and these Khalistani groups, they got supply of weapons, training, access to terror infrastructure from where they could operate and target India. So this connection is very important between Afghan conflict and Khalistan movement. Who created this connection? Pakistan. That is why this was Pakistan's first major covert proxy war against India on such a scale. It had never done this before. So even before India could realize what was happening, by early 80s, multiple Khalistani groups had risen to power, and now they had the ability to carry out major attacks against India. Several Khalistani groups had come up. Babar Khalsa International, BKI, Khalistan Tiger Force, Khalistan Zindabad Force, Khalistan Commando Force, and many others. These were the various Khalistani terror groups that took shape in Punjab with support in Pakistan and a parallel support base in Western countries. Understood? So these groups started carrying out terror attacks in India, especially in Punjab. They would attack police stations, they would target ministers and politicians as well. They tried carrying out attacks in Delhi. They hijacked a few planes as well. So early 80s is when the Khalistan movement rose to prominence and emerged as a security threat for India. Parallelly, in the Western countries, some members of the diaspora who were radicalized, they started backing the movement. In US, in Canada, especially in Canada, UK, Germany, France, Italy, etc. So across Western Europe and in North America, a support base was created among sections of the radicalized diaspora. Again, not everyone was a radical. Few elements had been radicalized. In India, majority of the Sikhs rejected the movement. Majority of the Sikhs were in favor of India. But few extremists were enough to turn this into a major terrorist movement against India. And Pakistan did not stop here. It was not just giving a terror safe haven and all the support needed, but the ISI started working in Western countries as well. Through its embassies, high commissions, and consulates in US, Canada, and Europe, the ISI started backing the diaspora members to create a security challenge in the West. The Khalistan issue was deliberately propped and supported in the West, and there was Pakistani intervention here as well. Many Gurudwaras in the West were misused for this purpose. These radical elements in the diaspora who were influenced by the ISI, who were getting funds from the ISI, they blocked Indian officials from entering the Gurudwaras. They imposed a ban. They manipulated the Gurudwara Prabandhak Committee, which manages the Gurudwaras, and imposed a ban on Indian diplomats, Indian officers from entering these Gurudwaras abroad. They turned the Gurudwaras into shelters for terrorists. After the terrorists carry out attacks in India, obviously Indian police, Indian intelligence agencies will start hunting them. They would run away from India with Pakistani help. Some would take shelter in Pakistan itself. Even today, you have few Khalistani leaders present in Pakistan. Some would run away to Western countries and take shelter here with the help of the diaspora members. They started organizing protests, rallies in Western countries, saying that India was committing human rights violations, targeting the Sikh community. That is why we are fighting for liberation of Punjab. Western governments wouldn't act against them because one, India was with Soviet Union, right? We had hostilities with the US. And next, these are so-called open liberal democracies, and they allow such protests, rallies to happen in the name of freedom of expression. Even though they were engaging in terrorism, violence against India, very soon they would become a global threat. Still, Western governments and their intelligence agencies were refusing to act because it was convenient for them. One was democracy and freedom of expression. That was their excuse. That any group can express their views. Why should we stop it? We are a free country. We will not stop rallies and protests. They have a right to protest. Whenever India raised the issue, this was their excuse. And secretly, they wanted India to suffer in a way because we were aligned with Soviet Union. Pakistan was their ally. So it was serving their geopolitical interests as well. So they did not act against these groups. And very quickly, support increased within the diaspora, and even Gurudwaras were misused for this purpose. So Pakistan was not only giving cross-border support by giving shelter to these terrorists, training, funds, and weapons, but it was extending support in Western countries as well through the ISI. Is that clear? So this is how the Khalistan movement escalated and started becoming a major threat to India. By 1983, this had become one of the biggest security challenges for India. Because the challenge was not just in Punjab. It was not just a domestic challenge. There was a foreign angle to it. There was cross-border support from Pakistan. There was a situation in Western countries which was creating pressure on India. So there were multiple challenges that India had to deal with. So as the attacks increased, as Khalistani extremism increased and became a threat, the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi came up with a strategy. The then Indira Gandhi government came out with a strategy which has been seen as very controversial. Some say that this was a security strategy to break the Khalistan movement and the support base. Some criticize the Indira Gandhi government by saying that it was a political strategy just to divert the votes in Punjab. Let me tell you what happened, then you'll understand. Now, in Punjab, which party was cornering all the votes? Which was the major party? Akali Dal. Because Akali Dal had consolidated all the Sikh votes, right? Because it was acting as the representative of the whole Sikh community. It had propped the Khalistan ideology mainly for this reason, for electoral political reasons, to keep the Sikh voters united. So they vote only for one party and Akali Dal will continue to dominate. Now, for the Congress, Akali Dal was a political rival. Congress was in power at the center, but in Punjab, Akali Dal was dominating. That was the political situation. Parallelly, The prime minister, the government was concerned about the situation, increasing terror attacks. We realized the Pakistani support, the covert war, the Western indifference, the neglect of Western countries. Right? India was realizing what was happening. So what India did was, the then Indira Gandhi government, they introduced a very controversial figure into the politics of Punjab. His name was Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. You might have heard about him. You might have seen his images as well. He was a religious preacher. He was a religious preacher with a big fan following. He was someone who could speak very well, or he was a great orator. He could easily impress people, especially the youth, and attract them towards his cause. So Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale was allegedly introduced by the government itself as a strategy. Was it for political reasons or security reasons? We can't sit in judgment of that. There is a controversy around it, but again, as I told you, we can't sit in judgment of that, mainly due to lack of evidence. Some say that it was a intelligence strategy, a security strategy to break the Khalistan movement. Because one way to break Khalistan movement was to internally destroy the support base. There is a direct link between the politics that was happening here in Punjab and the security situation that was unfolding. So one way to break the Khalistan movement was to break the political support base for Akali Dal. So some say it was a right intelligence-driven strategy, a strategic choice made by the Indira Gandhi government to use another figure, controversial figure, to divide the Sikh community, to divide the Punjabi votes and draw them away from Akali Dal. If Akali Dal loses elections, Khalistan movement will die out automatically. Understand the link? So some say it was a justified strategy to use Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale and promote him secretly so that he could rise as a new leader in Punjab. He could create a fan following, pull the voters away from Akali Dal, and thus defeat Akali Dal, which would lead to the collapse of Khalistan movement as well. But some criticize the government. They criticize Indira Gandhi as well. They say that this was only driven by politics and electoral considerations. They say that Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale was propped to benefit the Congress, because if Akali Dal loses, Congress would benefit. Congress would penetrate into Punjab. The answer somewhere lies in the middle. What many experts have indicated is that this was a mix of both. See, any party, any government, any leader will be interested in elections, in politics, winning votes. But many officers who worked at this point, they've written extensively about this. Some of them justify it, saying, of course, governments will have political motives, but they also say it was a right strategy at that point. In that context, they say it was a right strategy to break the political support for Akali Dal. They say it was a deliberate intention of the Indira Gandhi government to promote Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale so he could divide Punjab's politics, pull the votes away from Akali Dal, which would weaken Khalistan movement. So it was like hitting two birds with one stone. With one strategy, two objectives would be achieved. One, a security objective to protect India's national interests, security interests. That is, by weakening Akali Dal, we can bring down the support for Khalistan movement when there is a parallel leadership. Second, politically, it would benefit the ruling party. That's what politicians do. That's what parties do. So some justify it, some criticize it. Let's not sit in judgment of that. But this is what happened. There was some extent of support from the center, from intelligence agencies, given to Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale as a strategy to prop him as a new leader. Someone who could attract the voters, pull the youth away from Akali Dal, so Akali Dal weakens, loses elections, thereby bringing down Khalistan movement as well. But unfortunately, this strategy backfired. It backfired in a very bad way for India. Because Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale went on his own. He betrayed his backers, his supporters. He himself became a radicalized Khalistani leader. He was advocating Khalistani cause as well. But as he became more popular, he realized that his support base is coming because of Khalistani ideology. He himself became the biggest proponent of Khalistani movement and emerged as the biggest Khalistani leader of that point within months. Very similar to what happened recently with a guy called Amritpal Singh. I'm sure some of you would have read this in newspapers. Last year, there were some serious developments, right? An extremist called Amritpal Singh all of a sudden entered Punjabi scene, the political scene, and started propping the Khalistani ideology again, built a fan following, right? Eventually, we managed to arrest him. He and his followers are in jail right now. Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale was like him. In fact, Amritpal Singh was heavily inspired by Bhindranwale. He tried to mimic him, the way he used to speak, the way he used to dress. Amritpal Singh replicated that. He was trying to project himself as a new Bhindranwale. So Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale was such a figure, a controversial figure, used as a strategy, a political come security strategy to break the movement. But he himself adopted the extremist movement, became the topmost Khalistani leader himself, and took shelter in the sacred Golden Temple, the most sacred shrine in Sikhism in Amritsar, was taken over by Bhindranwale and his followers, and they turned it into a Khalistani base. Can you see how extremists misuse their faith? They don't spare sacred sites as well for their politics, for their religious fundamentalism. Problem again is not with religion. It is elements like these who misuse issues for their selfish political agendas. So Bhindranwale based himself out of the Golden Temple and he started accumulating Khalistani terrorists. Terrorists from all the groups would accumulate here. Hundreds of terrorists started taking shelter inside the Golden Temple. They started amassing weapons on a massive scale. The ISI was pumping weapons and turning the Golden Temple into a base. Pakistan knew the consequences. The communal angle was now clearly being induced. It was now being turned into a Sikh versus Hindu issue, a communal issue. That is the reason why the Golden Temple was used, rather misused. Then Indian intelligence agencies detected ISI's links with Bhindranwale. The ISI with other Khalistani groups and Bhindranwale, they had turned the Golden Temple into a terrorist base. Around 500 to 600 Khalistani terrorists had taken shelter and they had amassed a massive stockpile of weapons, from guns, pistols to assault rifles to a very large ammunition dump was created inside the Golden Temple, creating a major security situation. Parallelly, there were cross-border incidents. Constantly infiltration was happening. There was flow of drugs, weapons, and funds from across the border. Drug addiction had become a problem. Violence, law and order situation was developing across Punjab. So essentially, by 1983, things had become extremely volatile in Punjab. Is that clear? So India was under pressure. Tensions were building up, political, social tensions, communal tensions. Border threats had increased. Amongst the diaspora in Western countries, pressure was increasing as they were giving support to Khalistani cause. They were carrying out protests in front of Indian embassies and consulates. They were trying to target Indian diplomats. So the situation was getting out of hand. Indian intelligence agencies kept a close watch on the role of Pakistan, what Pakistan was doing throughout. Now, it was up to the Prime Minister to act. Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale had gone out of hand. He himself had turned against India. Plus, there were other groups, other terrorists to deal with. So, this was one of the most complex challenges faced by India. So, at that point, at that critical point, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was forced to take some decisive decisions. Controversial, but decisive. The advice from most experts to the Prime Minister was don't touch the Golden Temple. The Prime Minister was well aware of the consequences. It's the most sacred shrine. If you send troops to target the terrorists, yes, they are terrorists, they are a threat to the nation, but if we go on a full frontal attack, it will be interpreted as an attack on the Sikh community. It will trigger members of the Sikh community, it will become a religious conflict, and the movement could escalate. So India waited for some time because it was complex. It was not easy to take a call. But eventually, the situation reached a point where India couldn't sit idle anymore. Because more terrorists were accumulating, large stockpile of weapons was entering, law and order had fully broken down. It was important to send a strong message and take strong action to wipe out Khalistan movement. So the Prime Minister ordered a very controversial operation, Operation Blue Star. The year was 1984. Bhindranwale had risen in his popularity in just 1 year, turned the Golden Temple into a terror base. There was direct Pakistani support for this. So India decided to act. No matter the consequences, this had to be done. So Prime Minister Indira Gandhi authorized Operation Blue Star, which was led by Indian Army Special Forces. The objective was to flush out the terrorists from Golden Temple, secure the Golden Temple, eliminate the terrorists, especially Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. The target was Bhindranwale. Kill Bhindranwale, if possible, capture him, eliminate the terrorists, get hold of the weapons, flush out the temple, or else this would become a security nightmare. Imagine what hundreds of terrorists with so much weapons could have done. They would have unleashed havoc across Punjab. So Operation Blue Star, it dragged for almost 6 days. It was not an easy battle for the Indian Army because this was our first experience with urban warfare, urban terrorism. Amritsar is a city. If you've been to Golden Temple, you can see how densely populated the area is. It's not easy to conduct a precision military operation in such a populated area where there is tremendous local support for the terrorists. So Punjab police, they secured the area. Paramilitary forces were also brought in, right, to assist the Indian Army. And the special forces took over and launched a full-fledged attack against these terrorists. This was Operation Blue Star. The mission was kill Bhindranwale, eliminate the terrorists, secure the Golden Temple. This battle raged for 6 days because Indian forces were not fully prepared for what the terrorists had. Indian intelligence indicated that they had some guns, assault rifles, maybe some grenades. But after the operation began, Indian forces were shocked because they brought out RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades. These were used in Afghanistan by Afghan Mujahideen. Now, this was in the hands of Khalistani terrorists in a city inside the Golden Temple. They fired rockets at the Indian Army. Right? Battle tanks were brought. So this became a deadly battle, lasting 5 to 6 days. And it was a brutal, bloody operation. Hundreds of terrorists were killed. Many civilians also got killed. That's what happens in such a conflict. It was urban warfare. Right? In a densely populated, tight, closed environment. Right? Any such operation will be complicated. It will result in severe casualties. Indian Army lost many soldiers. Right? Many were martyred. Many civilians got trapped in between. But eventually, the operation was a success. Bhindranwale was eliminated. He was killed. Most terrorists were killed. Many were arrested. Finally, Golden Temple had been freed. It was flushed out of the terrorists. It was fully sanitized. And Operation Blue Star was a success. But as anticipated, the consequences began. It was known. The political security consequences was a given fact. This was interpreted as an attack on the Sikh faith itself. That is how the extremists projected it. They blamed the prime minister. They held Indira Gandhi responsible for Operation Blue Star, and they gave a call to assassinate the prime minister. So after Operation Blue Star, support for Khalistan movement went up. Until now, I told you, majority of the Sikhs did not support the movement. It was only few extremists. But now that propaganda began in India and abroad that a Hindu government, a Hindu majority India had targeted the most sacred shrine of Sikhs, this was shown as an attack on the Sikh community itself. The videos, images were circulated, right? The youth and other members who saw the images, visuals, they got instigated. They believed that it was a Indian attack against the Sikh community itself, when it wasn't. It was an attack against terrorists. It was a necessary operation. Government can't sit and watch sacred shrines being turned into terror bases, right? So as expected, there were political and security repercussions, because obviously in such a deadly operation, the temple would also suffer damage, right? High caliber weapons were used, not just guns, explosives, even battle tanks and small artillery was brought in. So obviously there would be damage to the temple itself. So this hurt the sentiments of the Sikh community, and now a propaganda started by the extremists that, see, as we told you, majority Hindu Indian government has targeted the Sikh community. Immediately support for Khalistan movement went up, especially within the diaspora and also in Punjab, and strong anti-India sentiments took root. The movement gained momentum, and they gave a call to assassinate Indira Gandhi as they held her responsible for Operation Blue Star. Then came the biggest tragedy. Two tragic events followed, which would turn the course of India. Within months, the Prime Minister was assassinated. Is that clear? Her security had been stepped up. There were several intelligence inputs that the Prime Minister's life is under threat. Active attempts were being made by the Khalistani terrorists to target Indira Gandhi. But despite all the measures, her own Sikh bodyguards who were radicalized they assassinated the Prime Minister in October 1984. The intelligence agencies had advised the Prime Minister to remove any Sikh presence in her immediate vicinity, especially in her security team, because a trust deficit had come up. There were few Sikh soldiers in the army who had been radicalized. In security forces as well, Khalistan ideology was rising among some of the members. This had triggered concerns. So Sikh members were being isolated on religious lines. This was leading to religious profiling. So the Prime Minister said, if we don't use Sikh bodyguards and we don't trust the community, what message will be sent to the community? Right? If you remove all the Sikh bodyguards, right, the message is that we don't trust the Sikhs. Yes, there might be some radical elements. The threat has gone up, but doesn't mean we should send out the wrong message. So she refused to follow the advice of the agencies, and she deliberately advised them to add Sikh bodyguards in her security teams. And as it turned out, her own bodyguards, who were from the Indian forces, they had been radicalized. They were Khalistani members. They had been influenced by the Khalistani ideology, and they assassinated the Prime Minister. Is that clear? So a sitting Prime Minister being assassinated. This was a huge setback for India. It's not about the individual. It's not just about the party they belong to. It's about the office they hold. Imagine a serving Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy being assassinated by terrorists. That to her own bodyguards being radicalized by a terrorist ideology. This was our biggest security intelligence failure, as the agencies failed to protect the PM. In many ways, in many ironic ways, Pakistan got its revenge for 1971. That is how geopolitics and covert wars work. Because it was Indira Gandhi who was primarily responsible for liberation of Bangladesh and breaking Pakistan into two parts. Pakistan had sworn revenge against India for 1971. That's why it launched a covert war against India, backing Khalistan movement. Eventually, the Khalistani terrorists assassinated the prime minister. So indirectly, Pakistan got its revenge. But this triggered a chain of disastrous events in the country, which would further increase the problems. This was just the beginning. Don't think this is the end of it. This was just the beginning. Even now, majority support was in favor of India. Even now, the movement could have been tackled. But what happened the next day after the assassination of Indira Gandhi is something that embarrasses India till this day. In India's independent history, there are some shameful moments. This was one of them. Following the assassination of the prime minister, widespread anti-Sikh riots broke out, apparently with state support. It's one of India's most shameful events, in line with the demolition of Babri Masjid, the Hindu-Muslim riots, the Godhra riots. This incident is on the same lines, where there was a degree of state support, a degree of tolerance amongst the police forces to allow the riots to happen, where innocent Sikhs were targeted and slaughtered. And there was support from some members of the ruling party. Is that clear? So this was seen as a retaliation against the Sikh community for assassinating Indira Gandhi. So as the government, the security forces failed to prevent the crisis, they didn't act on time, and few party leaders were involved in the targeted hate against the Sikh community, it led to a devastating incident. For several days and weeks in Delhi especially, and in other parts of India as well, innocent Sikhs were targeted and up to 3,000 Sikhs were slaughtered. Especially the Sikh neighborhoods in Delhi, these were all refugee colonies when Sikh refugees had come in 1947, like Karol Bagh, Rajendra Nagar, and many other colonies. These were all refugee colonies. So all Sikh members were present in few localities. These localities were targeted by mobs who were instigated by certain party members with support from the police as well to target the Sikh community. Houses were burnt, entire neighborhoods were burnt, even women, children were slaughtered. Right? This was an embarrassing event for India, shameful event. That's why I told you it's on line with, or it's on the same lines as that of the demolition of Babri Masjid, the Hindu-Muslim riots that followed, the Godhra riots. Right? These are some shameful events, and I'm pointing this out deliberately because these communal events, they have had a direct impact on security of India. Let me explain. 1984, then 1991, 92, and 2001. Three major communal events in the country. One was anti-Sikh riots under the Congress, Babri Masjid demolition by Hindutva extremists, the burning of the Godhra train, right, by Islamist elements, and the retaliatory radical Hindutva mobs targeting Muslim communities in Gujarat. These events directly exposed the communal fault lines in India. The Hindu-Sikh fault line, Hindu-Muslim fault line stood exposed. And guess who exploited this? Pakistan has exploited each and every opportunity. After 1984, Pakistan got a ready support base to further scale up Khalistan movement against India. Because obviously the victims of this violence, right, now they clearly held resentment against India, against the state, against Indians in general. Widespread support came in from majority of the Sikh community members, and especially in the diaspora as well, that this was a genocide of the Sikhs. Right? 3,000 plus Sikhs were slaughtered for no reason. These were innocent people who had nothing to do with Khalistan movement. and that too with state support, an element of support from the ruling party. Till date, justice has not been done fully to the victims of this violence. So this became a rallying point. Khalistani extremists captured this point with the help of Pakistan and turned the propaganda against India. They stepped up the propaganda. Large scale support came in for Khalistan movement after this, and all the Khalistani groups got tremendous support. More funds came in. Members of diaspora started sending donations. They started donating to the cause to aid acts of terrorism against India, to liberate Punjab from India. You will see the same happening after Babri Masjid demolition and Godhra riots. I'll come to it later. We'll discuss pan-India terrorism. There I will explain how Pakistan has exploited the Hindu-Muslim divide that emerged later because of communal polarization in India. These are the deadly mistakes committed by our political parties. I'm not blaming one particular party here. There are two major parties involved in this. So the opening of these social divisions in India has benefited the enemy, that is Pakistan. That is the point I'm trying to make. It's not about blaming one party or the other. As I told you, both parties are involved in this. What I'm saying is that when your internal divisions open up, it creates opportunities for the enemies of the country, which they will exploit, and Pakistan has done it. Khalistan movement became more notorious after anti-Sikh riots because there was a big support base now. Even moderate Sikhs who never supported the movement, they were horrified by the anti-Sikh riots, and they also got radicalized. They started supporting the Khalistan movement. The same would happen after Babri Masjid, after Godhra. Communal hotspots came up because of large-scale Hindu-Muslim riots, where several Muslim families had become victims. Pakistan tapped into this. The ISI tapped into this to raise new recruits for terrorism against India. That is why post-90s, you see escalation of terror attacks against India. Terror groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba and later Indian Mujahideen, they got direct support in India because new communal hotspots were opened up because of large-scale communal polarization. Is that clear? This is a very important concept, right? In the field of security, you need to understand that your country is safe as long as there is social unity. The moment divisions open up, and if political parties are involved in polarizing the society on religious lines or even on ethnic, racial lines, this will be the outcome. Manipur is another classic example. I'll come to it later in the next class. What has happened in Manipur, what has happened before as well, is largely a result of ethnic divisions being exploited by political parties. So if this is done for votes, if this is done for politics, right, it will benefit the extremists. It will benefit the enemies of the nation. That is the point you need to understand. Is that clear? I told you yesterday, I will not show religious bias. I'll not show any political bias. We are discussing things as it happened, right? Members of Congress party were involved in anti-Sikh riots. The BJP played a critical role. Various Hindutva outfits played a critical role in fanning communal polarization and in engaging in targeted riots in 90s and early 2000s. These disastrous events have opened up the divisions in the country, creating easy opportunities for Pakistan, and it has exploited those opportunities to step up its war against India. And we pay the price even today for that. Right? So it's very important to pay attention to these social issues as well, because it is connected to the security of the state. So now, Khalistan movement became a nightmare for India. After Indira Gandhi's assassination and anti-Sikh riots, massive support poured in India and abroad. And the scale of violence also went up, posing a major threat. And this was a point where it was believed that Punjab might even break away. It might secede from India. Because there was free flow of funds, weapons, and drugs. Large-scale support had come in now. It was very difficult for India to control the situation. Things were going out of hand. So 1984-85 was a dangerous period where it was believed that Khalistan movement might even succeed, or it might become a permanent situation, creating a major challenge for India. That is how bad things got by 1985. Understood? Don't think I'm wasting time here. Don't think I'm just spending time on one topic. I want you to understand this thoroughly because recently there have been similar attempts made again. UPSC will focus on it. If not a mains question, it could be asked in the interview. As the topics are little controversial, UPSC may avoid it in the mains. But in the interview, the panel will not hesitate to put you in the spot by asking complex questions. They would like to see where you stand. They would like to see whether you have any religious, political biases. So it's important to develop the right views and opinions. Now, coming to the last part of my discussion here, how did India fight back from here, from 1985? Now we know 1985 was the peak of Khalistan movement, right? The threat was very, very serious. Things had gotten completely out of control. But if you fast forward one decade, by 1995, by then, Khalistan movement had been almost eliminated. That's why when you grew up as kids, you would have never heard about this, right? Or you would have heard about it only recently in the last few years. Otherwise, the current generation, right, which grew up in the 90s and early 2000, they would have never heard about this crisis. They wouldn't know much about the Khalistan movement. Why? Because the movement didn't even exist. So how is this possible? In 85, it was our biggest challenge. In just 10 years, it didn't even exist. People wouldn't even speak about it because the movement had ended. We had almost wiped it out entirely. So something remarkable must have happened between these years, right? In this decade, something remarkable must have been done by India, or else the issue wouldn't have died down. So that is what we have to study, how India fought back. What measures were taken by subsequent governments, not just the central government, but by the state government as well. What measures were implemented to tackle the threat? Now, what was the challenge in front of us? One, within Punjab, there was widespread domestic support, especially after Operation Blue Star and after anti-Sikh riots. Domestic support had increased. Correct? This was one major problem. Next, border security had become critical because of the free flow of drugs, money, and weapons. This is what was fueling the movement. Then, Pakistan was the next headache. There was direct state support, external state support coming from Pakistan. A safe haven existed for these terror groups along the Af-Pak border. You will not believe, we even gave evidence to US from one terror attack that Khalistani terror groups had carried out. We had collected some bomb samples and weapon samples that we had confiscated. We gave that to the American authorities. We showed them, see, this is your consignment. This belongs to you. It was in the hands of Khalistani terrorists. Who do you think gave it to them? Right? We told them it was Pakistan. We urged the US to act against Pakistan. But they refused to listen. They didn't care about it because, as I told you, Pakistan was critical for them. Pakistan was their ally. India was hostile. India was with Soviet Union. They didn't care about India. They said, see, this is your problem. We will not put that kind of pressure on Pakistan. They even didn't act against the radical diaspora elements within their soil. So India was helpless at that point. So this was the other challenge. Pakistan, the state support, the safe haven there. The next big challenge was the support in the Western countries. The support base that was created within the diaspora, the strong support within the diaspora. And how do we convince Western governments to act? They hardly bothered about this issue. We raised it diplomatically many times. They wouldn't care. They wouldn't act. So this was the situation, this was the challenge. All right, so let's discuss what was done by India. To wipe out the movement, we had to hit all the four. We had to hit the domestic support, the cross-border support, external state support, and the indifference in Western countries. All the four had to be targeted. The then Rajiv Gandhi government, Rajiv Gandhi, son of Indira Gandhi, had taken over. So Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, the government of India under Rajiv Gandhi and the Punjab government, they introduced AFSPA. Punjab was declared as a disturbed area under the Disturbed Areas Act. Punjab was declared a disturbed area under the Disturbed Areas Act, which is a precondition for imposing a controversial law called AFSPA, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. It is implemented in conflict zones where insurgency, terrorism is very active. It had already been implemented in Northeast India. From 1950s itself, AFSPA was in place in Northeast India. It had been expanded as Northeast insurgency also expanded. In Nagaland, Assam, Manipur, Mizoram, Tripura, across Northeast India, AFSPA had already been implemented by 1980s because we were dealing with multiple insurgencies in Northeast India. This controversial law was implemented in Punjab to give special powers to the security forces. Later, I will discuss AFSPA. Let's complete all these topics. Next weekend, I will talk about AFSPA as well. But for now, understand that this law gives special powers to security forces which are involved in counter-terrorist, counter-insurgency operations. But the condition to impose AFSPA is that the area should be first declared as a disturbed area under Disturbed Areas Act. Once that is done, AFSPA can be extended. That will give special powers to security forces. So under these special powers, the Punjab police was restructured. The government decided that let's not use Indian Army because Indian Army involvement in Operation Blue Star had already become controversial. As I told you, armed forces use excessive power. In fact, the Golden Temple crisis would have been better resolved if we had a specialist force like NSG. Do you know why NSG was created? It was created after Operation Blue Star because we learned lessons. We learned that Indian Army may not be effective in such a urban warfare environment. Indian Army has great capabilities, but that is for an external enemy in the border areas. If you bring that weapon and that kind of training to a city where your citizens and civilians are present, it is going to cause more damage. And we just studied the consequences of it, right? Many civilians were killed, backlash was generated, Prime Minister was assassinated. So after the crisis of Operation Blue Star, that is when we raised a specialist intervention force, a counter-terror force called NSG, National Security Guards, who specialize in urban warfare, who specialize in operating in tight areas where hijackings might take place, hostages might be held. That requires a special skill. It requires special weapons and special training. So a call was taken not to use Indian Army because of the controversy related to Operation Blue Star, and the primary role was given to Punjab police to fight the insurgency and terrorism within Punjab. For this reason, AFSPA was brought in, special powers were given to the Punjab police, and along with Intelligence Bureau, the Punjab police acted decisively against the domestic support base. Punjab police was restructured. Legendary IPS officers like KPS Gill were brought in. I'm sure you would have heard about KPS Gill, very popular IPS officer, largely credited for ending insurgency terrorism in Punjab. He was made the DGP of Punjab Police. Other top IPS officers like Julio Ribeiro and many others were brought in. These were experts in counter-terrorism, counter-insurgency. So such top officials were brought in, the whole structure was revamped. Special powers were given and a free hand was given to go behind these terrorists. The IB, which is responsible for domestic intelligence, would mount series of covert operations in Punjab targeting these outfits. This would be a coordinated operation. IB would infiltrate the groups, generate intelligence. Punjab police would target the local support. Many terrorists were killed, many were arrested, and within 3-4 years, the domestic support was wiped out by Punjab police. This was ruthless action. And with such ruthless action comes human right violations. The price will be paid by civilians. Yes, the situation was serious. Deadly, decisive action was needed. IB, Punjab police, and other agencies involved, they acted decisively because they had full political support. Special powers were given to them. They cracked down on these groups, they infiltrated them, they got specific intelligence, wiped out the leaders, cut off their finances, and most of the terrorists were killed. Many were arrested, but many allegations also came up of large-scale human rights violations. From fake killings to kidnappings, torture. Torture became the biggest concern. Because to aid counter-terrorism, a law was introduced, very controversial law, which we are going to study later, called TADA. The TADA was enacted in 1985. This was the first dedicated law of India against terrorism. It was introduced because of Khalistan movement. AFSPA gave special powers to the operations, to the police forces and the security forces. They could open fire to kill, and they will have legal immunity. They could search houses, destroy property as well without warrant. They could arrest people without warrant. Those were the special powers given. But you need a law to prosecute the terrorists who are arrested, who are detained. For that, a specific law was enacted by the parliament called TADA, Terrorist Activities and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act. Understood? It was introduced in 1985. This gave tremendous powers to law enforcement agencies in the country. It was specifically introduced to deal with Khalistan movement, but of course it was implemented across the country. And particularly in Punjab, these laws allegedly have been misused, abused by Punjab police and the security forces. Major allegations came up of kidnappings, tortures, custodial deaths, fake encounters and killings, because the laws empowered them to do it. Later, we will discuss AFSPA and TADA. I'll go through the provisions as well. I'll explain the problems with these laws. But for now, understand that this was the price that was paid. See, this is a complex situation. It's not a black and white world. It's not what's good and what's wrong, right? Today, it's easy to sit and judge. But those who dealt with the crisis, only they would know how challenging this was. So a lot of wrongdoings were committed. A lot of injustice would have happened as well. But some see it as a necessity. Given the scale of the crisis, the threat, some see it as a necessity. It's about what stand you take. So as civil service aspirants, of course, your stand should be that we can't compromise on security. Sometimes measures might be needed, but at any cost, human rights violations cannot be tolerated. Keep this very clear in your mind. No matter what the risk, no matter what the challenge, your forces cannot be seen to be committing human rights violations. You cannot have such laws where the powers are being abused blatantly, because many civilians might get caught. Many innocents might have been killed, tortured. And some of the guilty officers, they were never held accountable. They went scot-free. There was no justice. So this was the price, the cost of this war. But eventually, the Punjab police, they prevailed. Right? IB and Punjab police, they delivered a victory for India. The domestic support was wiped out in Punjab. Understood? This was done only through ruthless police action. State government and the central government gave full backing to these operations. So the price paid was few human rights violations, but the success was the movement, the domestic support almost came to an end. Next, the border challenge. Pakistan was pumping drugs, money, weapons, This is what fueled the domestic support. So the BSF with Intelligence Bureau stepped up border security. Smugglers and traffickers were targeted. Underground tunnels through which the goods would be smuggled, they were targeted. Border areas were fenced. Better border management was implemented. Better intelligence gathering. Through these measures, border security was improved to curb the flow of drugs, weapons, and money into Punjab. Clear? So, two challenges were tackled. Then came the Pakistani challenge. Ending the Pakistani support was critical. This is what fueled the movement in Punjab and abroad. It was Pakistan supplying the funds, the drugs, and the money, and the weapons. So, ending Pakistani support was critical to win this war, and here as well, India took a decisive step. So, what I'm going to tell you might shock some of you, but this is what happened. The then Rajiv Gandhi government ordered India's Foreign Intelligence Agency, RAW, Research and Analysis Wing, to mount a series of targeted covert operations inside Pakistan. These were deep cover operations in Pakistan designed to hit the ISI and the Khalistani leaders hiding in Pakistan. The target was to eliminate Khalistani terrorists who were hiding in Pakistani soil along the Afghan border. Some were in Karachi, some were in other parts of Punjab in Pakistan, getting shelter in Pakistan, support from the ISI. The goal was to neutralize some of them, eliminate some of them on Pakistani soil itself, meaning assassinate them, break the ISI support, impose a cost on Pakistan, punish Pakistan in its own way, because otherwise Pakistan would not back out. So RAW, which was given complete authority over the operation to mount these covert attacks against Pakistan, set up two covert units, CIT-J and CIT-X. Counterintelligence team, J and X, two elite covert teams were set up. Their goal was very clear. Target the Khalistani leaders, target their sources of funding, weapons, target some ISI officers as well who are working with Khalistani outfits. Put the pressure back on Pakistan. So then began a series of attacks in Pakistan from 1980, 85, 86 to 88, 89. It was a deadly period. Now, how am I saying this? On what basis am I claiming this? Can you write this in the exam? That's the big question. Of course, you can't write this in the exam, not as your opinion. So on what basis am I saying this? Because Indian government has never acknowledged this. According to Indian government, this never happened. This covert operation doesn't exist, right? So how do we know about it? Some experts, officers who are involved in these operations, they have given evidence many, many years later. All right. One legendary intelligence officer of India, B. Raman, even he was an IPS officer. Most of his career, he has worked with RAW, a very popular IPS officer. When he retired in 1990s, he was the head of counterterrorism at RAW. He retired as the director of counterterrorism at RAW. He has written a book many years after his retirement, after these issues had become history. He wrote a very popular book called The Cowboys of RAW. It's a tribute to R.N. Kao, Ramnath Kao, the founding director of RAW. When RAW was established in 1968 by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, she appointed his closest advisor, her closest advisor, that was R.N. Kao. He was from Indian Civil Services, the Colonial Police Service. Right? So R.N. Kao, who was an expert in the field of intelligence, who was with IB back then, was made the director, the first director of RAW, who established RAW as a formidable intelligence agency. He was known as a master spy in the region. He was credited with the liberation of Bangladesh. With Indira Gandhi, he worked closely in backing Mukti Bahini and in supporting the Bangladeshi liberation against Pakistan. The merger of Sikkim, Indian operations in Sri Lanka, and many such critical operations led by Raw was under RN Kao. So he was a legendary figure in the security and intelligence circles. He was the one who created the initial batch of Raw officers. So B. Raman, after his retirement, wrote this book as a tribute to Ramnath Kao. So it's called The Cowboys of Raw. If you get a time, if you get the opportunity, please read it. It's a great book. B. Raman goes into the details of some operations carried out by India in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. He dedicates a whole chapter to Khalistan movement because he was there personally. He dealt with it along with his colleagues. He reveals that Raw launched these covert operations with the backing of Rajiv Gandhi, and these covert teams were set up to punish Pakistan. The goal of one team, CITJ, was to target Khalistani leaders and the ISI backers who were supporting them. The target of the other team was to mount counter-attacks in Pakistani cities. Basically, tit-for-tat attacks. For every attack in Punjab, in a public place where civilians are getting killed, there would be counter-attacks in Pakistan. Counter-attacks in Pakistani cities to put the cost back on Pakistan. The idea was to increase the cost, make the war expensive, so that we push Pakistan back from backing the Khalistani outfits. So, of course, you don't have to write about this in the exam, but in the classroom, it's important to understand what happened, right? In the exam, let's say there is a question dealing with India's response to Khalistan movement. You can mention this by quoting B. Raman. This is a recognized book. It's validated. Other officers, experts of that era, journalists, they've all cross-verified what B. Raman has claimed, right? So in the answer, or let's say even in the interview, you can mention that B. Raman has written about it. It's not your view. It's not your opinion. But in Cowboys of Raw, B. Raman has written that Raw carried out covert operations in Pakistan to break the support for Khalistan outfits. You don't have to go into the details. You don't have to mention CITJ, CITX. You don't have to mention that Khalistani terrorists were eliminated. Counter-attacks took place. Don't mention any of that. Those details are not needed. It could be speculation as well because government has never acknowledged it. But you can say that B. Raman writes in Cowboys of Raw that Raw did engage in covert operations in Pakistan to impose a cost on Pakistan for sponsoring the Khalistan movement. Then it's not your opinion. You're not speculating. You're basing it on expert opinion, which is validated by others as well. Clear? So this, according to B. Raman, increased the cost on Pakistan. That was the strategy of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, and it worked. Pakistan could no longer bear the impact, right? There were targeted killings. There were attacks happening in Pakistan as well. This increased the cost of the war. So tensions were increasing. See, this was a very different era. The Cold War era was different. Countries would go to any extent in order to protect their interests, and as part of their rivalries, they would go to any extent. That's why India was backing LTTE. India was punishing Pakistan for what it had done in Punjab. In many ways, it was justified as well, right? From India's perspective, from India's national interest, it was justified to punish Pakistan. So as the cost went up, the tensions also increased. It was a secret war between ISI and RAW. So according to B. Raman, there were some interesting developments here. The King of Jordan, who took note of the increasing tensions, he intervened. You might ask, what did Jordan have to do with Khalistan movement? Jordan had nothing to do with it. But the King of Jordan was a very good friend of Rajiv Gandhi and the then Pakistani army chief. He was very close. Personally, he shared a relationship with India and Pakistan. In diplomatic circles, it was getting known that the covert war had increased, that India was retaliating against Pakistan and the tensions were going up. Potentially, it could have turned into a war as well in the future. So the King of Jordan, who was a good friend of Rajiv Gandhi and a good friend of Pakistani leaders as well, he offered to mediate. He spoke to both the leaders and said, send your chiefs, send your ISI chief and RAW chief to Amman, the capital of Jordan, a neutral country. Let them sit, discuss, negotiate, reach a settlement, end the covert war. And that is what happened. The ISI chief and RAW chief, they met in Amman in Jordan, and a settlement was reached between ISI and RAW to back off from this war. ISI promised to withdraw the support for Khalistani outfits. RAW promised to scale back its covert operations. It was a gentleman's understanding, meaning a trust-based understanding that we are promising something, you promise something, we both uphold our agreement, and we both will back off from this. Because the scale of violence was increasing and we were getting to a point where things would have gotten out of hand. So with the mediation of Jordan, ISI and RAW reached a settlement which brought this covert war to an end by 1990. This is how India pushed Pakistan back and put an end to Pakistan's covert support to Khalistan movement. If not entirely, at least majority of the support came to an end. Believe it or not, after this settlement, something very interesting happened. The ISI shared intelligence with RAW regarding few Indian soldiers in the Indian army who had been radicalized by Khalistani groups. There were few Indian army soldiers, unfortunately radicalized by Khalistan movement, planning an attack. The ISI, which got to know about this, passed information to RAW, which helped in preventing that crisis, that attack. So whatever India did, it gave results. The ISI was pushed back. ISI agreed to settle, withdraw support. It even shared intelligence later to help prevent some Khalistani attacks. That is how the movement started dying out so quickly. We eliminated the domestic support, secured the border, cut the flow of drugs, money, and weapons, and pushed Pakistan back. What was finally left was the diaspora and the Western governments. So here, MEA and RAW both played a big role in focusing on the diaspora and convincing Western governments to work with India. This is the last point. After that, we can go for the tea break. Just give me a few minutes. We'll finish this discussion and then we'll go for the tea break. See, in foreign countries, India couldn't do the same. It's not that India could go hunting Khalistani terrorists and they will sit silent. No country will tolerate foreign operations, right? So here we never had the option of going behind the Khalistani terrorists who are hiding in Gurudwaras, who are getting support from the diaspora. Instead, RAW stepped up its monitoring of the diaspora members in Canada, in US, across Western Europe, from UK to France to Italy to Germany. RAW's operations through the Indian missions were stepped up. That is intelligence gathering, monitoring. MEA would collect the evidence and use this to build pressure on Western governments. We would identify who are the Khalistani elements, how they are misusing Gurudwaras, organizing rallies, protests, and attacks against Indian interests. And we would bring diplomatic pressure on Western governments. But this was not enough. India would work with the diaspora community. There were many still who were in favor of India. Right? We would use them, take their help to influence the Sikh community. These were influence operations led by RAW and MEA. Cultivate ties, better ties with diaspora leaders. Many were still moderate. Yes, majority of them were supporting it, but there were many who were still moderate, who wanted good ties with India, who wanted to be a part of India. So the goal was to cultivate those ties, cultivate those leaders, use the diaspora to influence the radical members to give up this path of extremism. This was one strategy, right? Parallelly, we kept putting diplomatic pressure on Western governments by giving them evidence after evidence to show what these extremists were doing. India kept telling these countries that these guys are a threat. Not just for us, they're a threat to you as well. But they did not listen. As I told you, in some ways, they hated India at that point. They saw India as a Soviet ally, as a communist country, right? Pakistan was more crucial for them. They never bothered about this. They didn't act against it. Then something disastrous happened. There was a deadly terror incident, the bombing of Air Kanishka. A Khalistani terror group which had shifted base to Western countries, that is Babar Khalsa International. In India, BKI had been targeted. The leaders had ran away to Pakistan and Canada. And in India, we had wiped out BKI by 1985-86. So this terror group, which was now sheltered in Canada with support from diaspora, with support from Pakistan, they targeted Air India flights. Their plan was to bomb 2 Air India flights coming from Canada and Japan. Is that clear? This was in 1986-87. That was the period. So these Khalistani terrorists, they managed to smuggle bombs into 2 aircrafts. One was an Air India flight coming from Canada to India via Europe. The other was a Air India flight from Japan to India. Imagine these are commercial planes loaded with passengers, 300 plus passengers and crew. Luckily, the attack in Japan failed. Before the terrorists could board the flight, the bomb went off in the airport itself. It injured and killed only few people, but the aircraft was saved. Hundreds of lives were saved because the attack failed in Japan. But the flight coming from Canada, that is Air Kanishka, was not so lucky. The terrorists got on board, they placed the bomb, and it exploded over the Atlantic. The flight crashed into the Atlantic near UK. All passengers and crew were killed, more than 300 people. So when this attack happened, it was the biggest terror attack involving a commercial airplane. Before 9/11 attacks, this was the biggest attack in the world involving an airplane. The whole aircraft was brought down. All the passengers and crew were killed. Majority of them were Indians. Many were Canadians. And there were European, Western American nationals as well. Now, Western governments woke up, finally, because Americans were killed, Canadians were killed, Europeans were killed. Now they woke up to the threat. And finally, they gave some cooperation to India in wiping out the groups, putting pressure on them, arresting some of them, and ensured that Khalistani activities are erased from Western soil. This is how India fought this battle. The support in Western countries amongst the Sikh diaspora was also tackled. So by 91-92, Khalistan movement was already history. It was dormant. Because in Punjab, we had ended the domestic support. Border issues were resolved. Pakistan had been tackled. Support within diaspora had been tackled. So within few years, we had successfully brought down the movement. It was almost wiped out, because you can never ensure a full wipeout. There will be some remnants who are left behind, right? Many would have run away, changed identities, taken shelter in other countries, in Pakistan. You can't hunt everyone. It became a dormant movement. By and large, it was wiped out, but of course, there would be some remnants, and it became a dormant movement, right? So we thought this is the end of it. Later, AFSPA was removed. TADA became controversial. It was allowed to lapse as well. And things became normal in Punjab, and full stability came back. So India had won the war for now. But 15 years later, 15, 20 years later, we are seeing a repeat of these incidents. It started from 2010. Some of you might think revival of Khalistan is happening in last 1.5 years. No. You're reading about it in newspapers more frequently. That's why you think that. But since we are involved in monitoring and tracking this from a longer time, I can tell you when the revival started. It started in 2010. So in the last 13 years, organized attempt has been made to bring back the Khalistan movement. So let us study this last part after the break. Let's take a 30 minutes break. We'll come back at 5:40. We'll come back at 5:40 and we'll continue the discussion. Because given the recent developments, this is a big topic. Before, I used to teach Khalistan movement in 1.5 hours, 3-4 years back. Now, given what has happened in last 2-3 3 years, we have to spend a good 4 to 5 hours to cover everything. There are so many issues and challenges created for India, right? So let's discuss this last part after the break. Please come back at 5:40, and whatever questions are there, try to copy the questions, please, and post it in the new link. I'll take up the questions after the break, right? Please do that. The questions, just copy it and post it again in the next session, and we'll discuss this after 5:40.